Welcome to our examination of fiscal policy and economic health. As I noted earlier in the previous Prezi, fiscal policy comprises a government's spending and tax policies. The national government, through its budget process, annually approves a 12-month plan for raising revenue and spending revenue. The 12-month accounting period for revenue raising and spending is a fiscal year. The national government's fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th of the following calendar year and is named for the calendar year in which it ends. Therefore, the federal fiscal year 2015 begins on October 1st, 2014 and ends on September 30th, 2015. National government expenditures accounted for 25% of the GDP of the United States in 2009, unquestionably a substantial percentage of national economic output. Although government spending certainly can create jobs, its primary goal is to provide the services necessary to fulfill the Constitution's mission. The other side of the coin, tax policy, raises revenue needed by the national government to serve the people. Although the main goal of tax policy is to collect revenue, taxation also decreases the amount of money taxpayers have to spend in the marketplace and corporations have to invest. Hence, taxation may reduce consumer demand for goods and services, with possible effects on the unemployment rate as well as company profits. It may also affect investment, which contributes to economic growth. Thus, tax policy, like spending policy, powerfully affects the economy. To understand fiscal policy, we look next at the sources of the funds the federal government uses to run the nation, as well as the spending decisions that Congress and the President must make. The Constitution delegates the power of the purse to Congress. By the authority of the Constitution, Congress formulates and approves tax laws to raise money along with appropriation laws, legislation that authorizes the spending of government money for a fiscal year. The Constitution specifies that the House must introduce revenue-raising bills before the state can consider them. The House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee are the congressional standing committees from which tax bills emerge. Today, the national tax on individual income is the largest revenue source for the national government. The federal income tax is imposed on each individual's earned income, which is salary and wages, and unearned profits made from investments. The second largest revenue category, social insurance, includes taxes collected for Social Security and Medicare. Because employers deduct from workers' paychecks the amount they owe for social insurance taxes, these taxes are referred to as payroll taxes. The federal government's third largest revenue source is corporate income taxes. The national government also collects excise taxes, which are taxes levied against a specific item such as gasoline or liquor, estate and gift taxes, and custom duties, which are import taxes. Taxes levied by the federal government do not affect the income of all taxpayers in the same way. The national income tax is a progressive tax because it takes a larger percent of the income of wealthier taxpayers and a smaller percentage of the income of less well-off taxpayers. Most taxpayers view a progressive tax, theoretically based on a person's ability to pay, as fair. Some people believe that a proportional or flat tax, which takes the same percentage of each taxpayer's income, is fairer than a progressive tax. A flat tax of 10% would equal $3,500 for a person earning $35,000 and $13,500 for a person earning $135,000. Although these two taxpayers pay a different amount of taxes, the proportion of their income collected is the same, hence the name proportional tax. Taxes can also be regressive. A regressive tax takes a greater percentage of the income of lower income earners than of higher income earners. States' sales taxes are the prime example of a regressive tax. Taxes may affect various taxpayers differently because the government grants tax expenditures, better known as tax breaks or tax loopholes. These are government financial supports to individuals and corporations to encourage behaviors that ostensibly enhance the public good. Tax breaks and loopholes allow taxpayers to pay lower taxes on their income than they would otherwise pay. For example, to encourage home ownership, the government gives tax breaks to individuals paying interest on a home mortgage. The government also offers tax breaks to businesses for job creation and worker retraining. State and local governments, as well as nonprofit organizations that provide a public service, pay no federal taxes. Thus, we say that they are exempt from federal taxes. Included in this group of tax-exempt organizations are the overwhelming majority of colleges and universities, which are public or nonprofit institutions. They are tax-exempt because they provide the public good of higher education without making a profit. They must invest any surplus money back into the institution. Tax expenditures and tax cuts would not be such a big concern if the government raised enough money to balance its budget. Unfortunately, deficit spending is the norm for the government. How is the government spending all of its money? Decisions the federal government makes about spending significantly affect both the national economy and the ability of individuals to achieve their American dream. Although setting the budget is an annual process, with Congress and the President approving a spending plan one fiscal year at a time, not all national government spending is approved annually. For the government to spend money, Congress and the President must enact laws that establish budget authority, which is the legal authority for agencies to obligate government spending. Programs granted budget authority through annual appropriation acts are discretionary programs. There are two categories of discretionary spending programs: security programs and non-security programs. Security spending is a bigger piece of the budget pie than is non-security spending. Security programs spending include expenditures for the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and international affairs. Non-security spending covers an array of activities and programs, including the administration of justice, agriculture, education, energy, environment, health, housing, income security for the poor and disabled, and transportation. Congress and the President deliberate each year over how much budget authority to include in annual appropriation acts for these discretionary spending programs. Typically, Democrats and Republicans differ on their priorities for discretionary spending programs. As the share of the budget spent on discretionary spending has been shrinking because of the growing share that goes to mandatory spending, the partisan battles between Democrats and Republicans become even more intense. The way to think about that is discretionary, so it's up to their discretion. They can choose to spend what they want versus mandatory, which they have no choices about. The largest share of the national budget pays for mandatory spending, which includes programs whose budget authority is provided in laws other than annual appropriation acts. The budget authority for mandatory spending is established in the authorization legislation that created the program and is open-ended because it obligates the government to pay for the program every year, whatever the cost may be, as long as the program exists. Social Security, income security for retired Americans and people with certain disabilities, Medicare, health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid, health insurance for low-income individuals, are prime examples of mandatory spending programs. Because the government is legally obligated to pay back money it borrows, payments for the national debt also fall within the categories of mandatory spending. In the annual budget process, Congress and the President do not make annual decisions about most of the money spent by the national government because most expenditures are mandatory. Other than interest payments on the debt, mandatory spending could be controlled by Congress and the President by rewriting the legislation that established these open-ended budget obligations. Recent attempts to rewrite the legislation that created the Social Security retirement program have shown that many mandatory programs are politically difficult to change. This is partly because elected officials fear the impact such changes would have on their re-election prospects, and partly because of partisanship. Not only do Democrats and Republicans disagree on the proper reforms, but also members of both parties disagree among themselves on specific reforms. Hence, mandatory spending continues to grow as a percentage of the federal budget. The federal government creates its programs through authorization legislation that specifies the program's goal and establishes whether its budget authority is obligated for the life of the program, mandatory spending, or must be set annually, discretionary spending. In an annual appropriation process, Congress and the President establish yearly funding for discretionary spending programs and possibly change tax policy to increase revenue raised to pay the bills or to cut taxes in an effort to stimulate the economy. This process begins in the executive branch. The budget process officially starts about a year and a half before the beginning of the fiscal year for which budget authority will be obligated. For example, work on the budget for fiscal year 2015 began during the spring of 2013. The process begins when the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, sends the President's budget priorities, policy and financing preferences, to the executive branch agencies. Executive branch agencies use the President's guidelines to formulate their funding requests. Typically, these requests are incremental changes, small increases, to their current fiscal year's budget authority. The budget requests work their way up the executive branch hierarchy to the OMB. The OMB reviews the budget requests, conducts hearings in which the agency justifies their requests, and analyzes the requests in light of economic forecasts. The OMB then submits its budget recommendations to the President, who works with the OMB to create a proposed fiscal plan for the entire national government for the upcoming fiscal year. The OMB drafts a budget document and a budget message, collectively labeled the executive budget, which explains the President's fiscal plan. The President is required by law to submit the executive budget to Congress by the first Monday in February, 8 months before the fiscal year begins. Once Congress receives the President's executive budget, the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, the legislative branch's counterpart to the OMB, swings into action. The CBO analyzes the executive budget in light of economic forecasts and predicted government revenues. The House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee use the CBO's analysis, along with reports from other congressional committees, to develop the concurrent budget resolution, which establishes a binding expenditure ceiling, the maximum amount that can be spent, and a binding revenue floor, the minimum amount that must be raised, as well as proposed expenditure levels for major policy categories. The House and the Senate must both agree to the concurrent budget resolution. This agreement is to occur by April 15th, less than 6 months before the fiscal year begins. After approval of the concurrent budget resolution, the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees each draft appropriation bills to provide budget authority for discretionary programs. To comply with the concurrent budget resolution, Congress may also need to revise the legislation that authorized selected government programs. For example, the House and Senate may have to agree to change the open-ended budget authority in existing legislation to comply with the expenditure ceiling in the concurrent budget resolution. Or they may have to agree to changes in tax legislation to meet the revenue floor specified in the concurrent resolution. Budget reconciliation is the annual process of rewriting authorization legislation to comply with the concurrent budget resolution. The deadline for completion of the reconciliation process is June 15th, less than 4 months before the fiscal year begins. Congress has until the end of June to approve the 12 appropriation bills that fund the national government for the upcoming fiscal year. This timetable leaves 2 months for the President to approve the bill so that by October 1st, the national government can begin the new fiscal year with budget authority for discretionary spending programs. If Congress and the President fail to approve one or more of the appropriation bills by October 1st, Congress must approve a continuing resolution to authorize agencies not covered by approved appropriation laws to continue to spend money within their previous budget year's levels. The nature of the annual budget process is such that at any given time, some government body in the executive or legislative branch is preparing a future budget, even as the executive branch is implementing the current budget. At the same time, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, is evaluating the implementation of the previous fiscal year's budget. Thus, budgeting is a perpetual government activity, one that takes up a great deal of national officials' times. Most Americans highly value the ideal of a balanced budget, in which, as we have seen, the government spends no more than the revenues that it raises. Although the nation had a budget surplus, money left over when all expenses are paid, for several years at the end of the 1990s, budget deficits, more money spent than collected through revenues, recurred as the first decade of the 21st century unfolded. Indeed, deficit spending has become the norm, not the exception. In February 2010, President Obama estimated the fiscal year 2010 deficit would be $1.6 trillion. What impact does fiscal policy dominated by federal spending have on the nation's economic health? A government that engages in deficit spending borrows money and hence goes into debt. Even as politicians, some economists, and many concerned citizens call for a balanced budget, with some people even proposing a constitutional amendment mandating this objective, deficit spending continues, and so the national debt grows. The long-term impact of the debt is legal obligation to pay back not only the money initially borrowed, the principal, but also interest, an additional amount of money equal to a percentage of the amount initially borrowed. In the case of government borrowing, future generations must pay back the debt of their parents and grandparents. Today, to pay off the $12.4 trillion national debt, each citizen would have to chip in about $40,000. Public debate is ongoing about the economic impact of long-term deficit spending and the colossal national debt, which is more than 3 times the amount of money the national government spends in 1 year. Some economists argue that the more money the national government borrows, the less money businesses can borrow to invest and expand the economy. In addition, many citizens grow increasingly concerned that today's deficit spending will burden future generations with the bill for current policies. Complicating the picture as the debt incurred from decades of deficit spending accumulates, the debt payment is becoming a larger proportion of the annual federal budget, increasing the percentage of the budget that pays for mandatory spending. I'm sure that you talked about that if you're taking macro. For the government to stop its deficit spending and ultimately reduce its debt, it must increase taxes, cut expenditures, or both. Elected officials do not like to reduce spending, however, because budget cuts often mean that some of their constituents will lose a service or their jobs. Nor do they like to raise taxes, because higher taxes mean that some citizens must give even more of their income to the government and thus have less to spend, invest, or save. Elected officials fear that citizens harmed by spending cuts and tax increases will not vote for them on Election Day. While elected officials struggle with budget decisions and their impact on re-election hopes, appointed officials, whom citizens cannot hold accountable through the ballot box, make monetary policy, which we'll talk about soon.